This black woman has no business being on this plane. People like her are always violent, Karen Miller shouted, pointing at a black woman opposite her. I don't know how she got on this line, but I'm not getting on this flight until she is arrested and removed. She's obviously sneaking her way into first class because she does not belong here. Karen, a white woman who carried herself with unwavering self-importance, continued. Her manicured nails gripped the handle of her designer purse, her expression one of pure disgust. Furious eyes burning with entitlement, her voice echoed across the boarding gate. The airport was bustling, filled with tired travelers eager for their flights, but her voice cut through the noise like a knife. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. Some passengers glanced at each other, hesitant, unsure whether to step in or step away. Others watched with interest, quietly forming their own opinions. Standing in the middle of it all was Imani Jackson, a young black woman. Imani didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to argue or prove herself. Her presence alone spoke volumes that Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Imani Jackson was elegant, intelligent, and composed, effortlessly beautiful. A black woman who had built her success with resilience, not privilege. And yet, to the untrained eye, to someone blinded by their own assumptions, she was just another ordinary passenger. And that's exactly how she wanted it. Dressed in a simple yet stylish travel outfit, Imani had no desire to flaunt her wealth or status. In fact, no one on that flight knew who she really was. No one knew that she was the CEO and chief board member of one of the most successful airline companies in the country. Imani had never been one to chase validation. She had been out of the country for years, and even the staffs of the airline didn't know her, except the other board members, because she never showed up for meetings and was most times represented. Imani recently flew in a week before, and now she decided to fly her airline anonymously. She did it to see everything firsthand, to make sure her airline treated every passenger fairly, as she had witnessed bias before. She had seen how people were treated differently based on how they looked, how they dressed, how much others assumed they were worth. But what Karen Miller didn't realize was that Imani wasn't just another passenger. She was the last person you wanted to underestimate. And then there was Karen Miller, a woman who walked through the world as if it belonged to her, wealthy, privileged, arrogant. Karen had spent her life controlling the spaces around her. The moment she saw Imani standing in that line, waiting to board that plane, she decided without hesitation, without reason, that she didn't belong. She had built an entire life around the idea that she was superior, that she deserved more because she was white, and that people like Imani should know their place. The first-class boarding line moved smoothly, passengers adjusting their bags, checking their tickets, making last-minute phone calls before stepping onto the plane. And then there was Karen, standing at the front of the line, scanning the crowd, her sharp eyes moving with a sense of entitlement. Then she saw Imani Jackson. A simple outfit, no designer labels, no expensive jewelry, no obvious display of wealth. To Karen, Imani didn't belong. She barely glanced at Imani's face before her mind was already made up. She was certain she had just spotted an employee who had no business standing in this line. So, without hesitation, without a second thought, without even asking a single question, Karen gave an order. "You!" Imani turned, her expression neutral. "Take these bags and load them properly. And be careful. I don't want scratches on my luggage." There was no question in Karen's tone, just expectation. Passengers nearby paused mid-conversation, some glancing at each other, some looking away. No one spoke up. No one corrected her. And Imani? She didn't react the way Karen expected. There was no hesitation, no confusion, no awkward fumbling. She simply looked at Karen, her expression unreadable. And then, she smiled. "I'm a passenger, just like you." Her tone was calm, even unbothered. But Karen's face twisted with disbelief. She let out a short, dry laugh. "Oh, come on. We both know that's not true." Imani didn't respond. She simply held her ticket in hand, waiting. Karen's annoyance turned to impatience. She took a step closer, lowering her voice, but not in a way that made it any less venomous. "I don't know what kind of stunt you're trying to pull here, but you're in the wrong line." So, in true Karen fashion, she did what she always did when she wanted something handled. She flagged down an employee. Her hand shot up, and within seconds, a flight attendant approached. "Sarah Young, professional and clearly tense at being dragged into whatever was happening, asked, "Is there a problem, ma'am?" Karen let out an exasperated sigh, gesturing toward Imani as if she were discussing a misplaced item. "Yes, actually, there is." Passengers nearby pretended not to listen, but their ears were tuned in. Karen continued, speaking as if Imani wasn't even standing there. "This woman is trying to board first class. I don't know how she got here, but I think she's confused." Sarah blinked, glancing between Imani's composed expression and Karen's unwavering arrogance. She turned to Imani. "Ma'am, do you have your boarding pass?" Imani wordlessly handed it over. Sarah scanned the ticket, checked the seat number, looked at Imani again, then she turned back to Karen. "She's a first-class passenger, ma'am. Everything checks out." Sarah was a young professional but visibly nervous. She recognized Karen instantly, the kind of frequent flyer who demanded extra perks, filed unnecessary complaints, and expected the world to bend to her will. "Ma'am, every passenger here has been properly screened. If she's in this line, she has the right to be here." Karen let out a dramatic, exasperated laugh. "You've got to be kidding me. Well, that just doesn't make sense." Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Sarah tightened her grip on the scanner, her discomfort clear. "Ma'am, I assure you her seat is in first class. Everything is in order." Karen crossed her arms. "No, I don't think it is. I want to speak to a supervisor." Sarah hesitated. She could already feel the weight of the situation. "There's no need for that, ma'am. She's a confirmed first-class passenger. If you'll excuse us, we need to continue boarding." Karen stiffened. Sarah had cut off her authority, denied her the power she was used to having. And that was unacceptable. But before she could snap back, before she could make an even bigger scene, she noticed something. The other passengers, they were watching. And now it wasn't just unease in their faces. It was judgment, not toward Imani, but toward her. And Karen hated being embarrassed even more than she hated being wrong. So, with a sharp inhale, she forced a tight smile. "Fine." Her voice was clipped, sharp, but she backed down, for now. And as Imani turned to board the plane, unfazed, untouched by Karen's entitled fury, Karen stared after her, watching, waiting, because this wasn't over. Not yet, not even close. And Karen Miller, she wasn't the type to let things go. She was going to make sure Imani regretted this moment, and the next one, and the next. Karen Miller stepped onto the plane, her frustration barely concealed beneath her forced, tight-lipped smile. She had just been humiliated at the boarding gate, and she was still seething over it. She had expected Imani to back down, to move aside, like so many others had done before when confronted by her authority. But instead, Imani had simply stood there, unshaken, untouched by Karen's words. Now, as Karen moved through the first-class cabin, her eyes scanned the seating arrangement, searching for her assigned seat. When she found it, her stomach twisted into a tight knot. She stopped abruptly, her face paling, then immediately darkening in fury. She was seated right next to Imani Jackson. For a brief moment, she simply stood there, staring at the seat as if it had personally offended her. Then, before she could stop herself, she let out a dramatic huff, loud enough for everyone around her to hear. "Absolutely not," she snapped. "I refuse to sit here." Passengers turned their heads at the sudden outburst. A flight attendant, already sensing trouble, hurried over, her polite smile barely masking the tension in her eyes. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" Karen crossed her arms tightly, her fingers pressing into her sleeves. "Yes, there is a problem. I'm not sitting next to her," she said, jerking her head toward Imani. Imani, for her part, didn't even react. She was already seated, adjusting her carry-on beneath the seat in front of her, her expression calm, as if Karen wasn't even worth acknowledging. The flight attendant blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the blatant hostility. "Ma'am, these are the assigned seats. We can't make last-minute changes unless there's an available alternative." Karen let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Oh, I think you can make an exception. There is no way I'm spending this flight next to—" She stopped herself, eyes darting toward Imani before she could finish whatever sentence she had been about to say. Imani finally looked up, raising a single eyebrow, waiting. She wasn't angry. She wasn't upset. She wasn't flustered. She just watched, quiet, patient, unbothered. That made Karen even angrier. The flight attendant, growing more uncomfortable, spoke again, keeping her tone measured. I understand your frustration, ma'am, but we're fully booked. We don't have any open seats in first class. Karen's lips thinned. She turned toward the other passengers, scanning the cabin as if expecting someone to volunteer to trade seats. Silence. Passengers quickly busied themselves with their phones, flipping through in-flight magazines, avoiding eye contact. No one was about to get involved. Karen wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to being ignored. Her temper flared hotter. There has to be another seat. I cannot sit here, she insisted. The flight attendant hesitated, then sighed. Let me check with the crew. Karen folded her arms tighter, her nails digging into her skin, watching as the flight attendant disappeared toward the front of the cabin. Amani exhaled slowly, refocusing on her bag, adjusting her belongings with a kind of patience that made Karen's blood boil. How could she just sit there, unbothered, while Karen was being so obviously inconvenienced? Moments later, the flight attendant returned, offering an apologetic look. I'm sorry, ma'am, but as I said, the flight is full. There are no other available first-class seats. Karen's eyes flashed with irritation. That's unacceptable. She turned toward the other passengers again, louder this time, her voice filled with exasperation. Someone switch with me, please. Anyone. Again silence. Passengers pretended not to hear her, looking out the window, scrolling through their phones, suddenly interested in anything but the entitled woman demanding a seat change. Just when it seemed like no one would step up, a voice spoke. I'll switch. Karen turned sharply. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man with warm eyes and a quiet demeanor met her gaze. He was dressed in a navy suit, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. The flight attendant's shoulders sagged in relief. That would be very helpful, sir. Thank you. Karen straightened, a smug smirk creeping onto her face. Of course, someone had finally given in. People always did, eventually. The man stood, gathering his things. Karen wasted no time, snatching her carry-on from the overhead bin and sliding into her new seat, as far from Amani as possible. As she settled in, she allowed herself to breathe again, her body relaxing into the cushioned seat. She had won again, or so she thought. Amani remained as poised as ever, turning her attention back to her belongings, preparing for the flight as if none of this had ever happened. Karen clenched her jaw, but she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The tension between Amani and Karen had settled into something cold and unspoken. It wasn't loud, not anymore. It was the kind of hostility that simmered beneath the surface, the kind that didn't need words. Karen had made it clear she wanted Amani gone, removed, erased from her presence entirely. But Amani, she wasn't here to fight for space that already belonged to her. The final boarding announcements played over the intercom as passengers made their last-minute adjustments, slipping their carry-ons into the overhead bins before settling into their seats. Amani stood, reaching for her luggage. The overhead bin above her seat was already packed, filled with suitcases from early boarders. She didn't make a fuss, didn't sigh in frustration, didn't even hesitate. Instead, she scanned the cabin for a nearby compartment with room. It didn't take long to spot one, a nearly empty bin just across from her seat. The only problem? It was directly above Karen Miller. Amani took a breath before stepping forward, lifting her carry-on with ease. It was a logical choice. There was ample space and the bins were shared. It was nothing more than a practical solution to a minor inconvenience. But just as she was about to place her bag inside, a sudden, forceful movement stopped her. Karen's hand shot out, snatching Amani's suitcase from her grip, yanking it down with unnecessary force. The bag slammed onto the floor with a loud, jarring thud. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers turned in their seats, eyes widening at the sudden aggression. Some whispered. Others sat frozen, unsure of whether to intervene. The energy shifted instantly. Karen was already standing, her face twisted in disgust, eyes blazing with something ugly. Absolutely not, she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the air. You are not putting your things near me. Amani blinked, staring at Karen with an unreadable expression. Slowly, deliberately, she bent down, picked up her bag, and dusted it off. Her composure didn't waver. She didn't lash out, didn't retaliate. She simply stood tall, adjusting the strap of her carry-on with quiet patience. Karen, she said, her voice level but firm. This is a shared cabin. Overhead bins don't belong to individual passengers. Karen's hands clenched at her sides. Her breathing had grown heavier, more erratic. I don't care, she spat. I don't want your things anywhere near me. Imani let out a slow breath. I'm just putting my luggage away. That's all. But Karen wasn't listening. She was spiraling because Imani wasn't backing down, and Karen couldn't stand that. No. Karen suddenly screeched. Before anyone could process what was happening, she grabbed Imani's carry-on with both hands and hurled it forward, violently, aggressively, like she was disposing of something filthy. The suitcase hit the ground with another heavy thud. Louder gasps. Passengers sat in stunned silence. A woman across the aisle put a hand over her mouth in shock. The energy in the cabin had shifted even further. It wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was disbelief. But Karen wasn't done. Imani bent down once more, retrieving her bag, her patience thinning now. She didn't argue, didn't shout. She simply reached for the handle. And that's when Karen did the unthinkable. With a furious shriek, Karen snatched the suitcase again. And this time, she threw it off the plane. Passengers sat frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Imani's carry-on tumbled through the open boarding door, landing with a heavy thud on the jet bridge below. A stunned flight attendant, who had just been returning to the cabin, stopped mid-step, her jaw slack. A crew member at the gate turned, eyes darting from the fallen suitcase to Karen, who stood there, chest heaving, hands shaking wildly. The silence that followed Karen's reckless, unforgivable act was deafening. Imani's suitcase lay discarded outside the plane, tossed like garbage. And the passengers, the flight crew, the entire first-class cabin, everyone had seen it. But Karen, she wasn't sorry. She didn't feel remorse, didn't feel embarrassed. If anything, the sight of Imani standing there, still calm, still composed, still refusing to react the way Karen wanted her to, that infuriated her even more, because Karen wanted a scene. She wanted Imani to break. She wanted to see her flustered, humiliated, defeated. And yet, Imani just stood there, unshaken. Now that was the final straw. Something inside Karen snapped. With a growl of frustration, she lunged forward. You need to move, she snapped, shoving her hands toward Imani in an attempt to push her away from the aisle. But Imani was done being silent. Before Karen's hands could make contact, Imani's arms shot up, her grip firm as she caught Karen by the wrists, stopping her mid-motion. The shift in power was immediate. Karen's entire demeanor changed. Her eyes widened, realization dawning, too late, that she had pushed too far. She wasn't in control anymore. Imani's fingers held Karen's wrists firm, but not forceful. She wasn't attacking her. She was stopping her. But Karen's face contorted into something vicious. She yanked at Imani's grip, and her voice rose to a shriek. Let me go. You're hurting me. Her sudden outburst was loud enough to be heard across the cabin. And that was when the supervisor came rushing in, eyes wide, her face a mix of shock and disbelief. What is going on here? Karen didn't miss a beat. She immediately switched tactics. Her entire body trembled, and her voice turned high-pitched, desperate, playing the victim flawlessly. She attacked me, Karen wailed, pointing at Imani with a dramatic, shaking hand. She grabbed me. She got violent. I was just defending myself. That's why I threw her bag out. She was threatening me. Imani, still composed, slowly released Karen's wrists. Her expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes now. That's not true, Imani said. The supervisor looked between them, clearly trying to process what had just happened. Hold on, let's slow down for a second, she said, her voice uncertain. Miss Jackson, did you? Karen cut her off before she could even finish. She's violent, she shouted, her voice shrill with manufactured fear. She needs to be removed from this plane. Arrest her. Imani, however, said nothing. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself, because she didn't need to. Within minutes, 2 uniformed security officers boarded the plane, their expressions unreadable as they approached the first-class cabin. The entire plane fell into a tense silence. One of the officers, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, spoke first. We've been informed there was an incident involving a disruptive passenger, he said, scanning the cabin. His eyes landed on Karen, who was still playing the part of the terrified victim, hands shaking for dramatic effect. "Yes, officer," Karen blurted out, her voice breathless, trembling. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Imani. "She threatened me. She got violent. She grabbed me. I don't feel safe sitting here." Imani remained still, her expression entirely unreadable. The security officer turned toward her, his expression neutral but firm. "Ma'am, is that true?" The weight of Karen's accusation hung heavy in the air as the security officer stood in front of Imani's seat. Passengers sat frozen, the tension thick enough to suffocate the entire cabin. Imani, still poised, still refusing to shrink under the scrutiny, sat with her hands resting on her lap, watching everything unfold. Karen, however, was far from calm. The moment she saw security step in, her confidence surged back. She straightened her posture, her breath still uneven from her fake tears, and turned her full attention to them, her allies. "She was aggressive," Karen exclaimed again, her voice pitched just right, carefully wavering to sell her act. "She grabbed me, and she wouldn't stop. I was terrified. That's why I had to defend myself. It was a masterful performance, and it was working." The security officer nodded firmly, his expression serious as he looked back at Imani. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us." A few passengers gasped audibly. Others shifted uncomfortably, their faces twisting in disbelief. Some, who had missed parts of the argument earlier, now assumed the worst. Imani remained silent. She didn't argue, didn't plead her case, because she knew something Karen didn't. The lead security officer gestured for Imani to stand. "We're going to need to remove you from the flight, ma'am." Karen folded her arms, her expression smug now. She had won, or so she thought, because just as the security officer reached for his radio to call for backup to remove Imani out of the plane, a new voice cut through the air like a blade. "That won't be necessary." The entire cabin went still, heads turned, and there, stepping onto the plane with effortless authority, was a sharply dressed airline executive. Behind him stood two more high-ranking officials. Their expressions were unreadable, but their presence alone sent a shockwave through the first-class cabin. A thick, uncomfortable silence settled over the first-class cabin. The presence of the airline executives had already turned the entire situation upside down. But what happened next would change everything. The lead executive, a man whose very posture radiated authority, took a step forward, his sharp eyes shifting from the security officers to Imani. Then, with a calm, steady voice, he spoke the words that would make the entire plane hold its breath. "Miss Jackson, I deeply apologize. We had no idea you were on this flight." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers sat up straighter, eyes widening. Some exchanged shocked glances. Others simply stared, trying to process what they had just heard. But the most notable reaction? Karen Miller. Her face went ghostly pale. Her posture stiffened. She felt a cold sweat creep up her spine. Because that name rang in her ears like a warning bell. "Miss Jackson?" She swallowed hard. "Wait, what?" Karen stammered, looking between Imani and the executive. "Miss Jackson? What? Who is she?" The executive's gaze snapped toward Karen, and for the first time since she boarded this flight, Karen felt something she wasn't used to feeling: fear. His expression was stone cold. "You just harassed and attempted to remove the CEO and chief board member of this airline from her own flight." Dead silence. Karen's heart stopped. Passengers erupted into hushed whispers, turning toward Imani with fresh, stunned expressions. "Board member? She owns this airline? No way. Oh my God. She's literally the CEO." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her thoughts were scrambling for an escape, a justification, an excuse, but nothing came. She had spent the last hour trying to assert her power over a woman who had more power than she could ever dream of. And now, everyone knew it. Karen felt the eyes on her, not in admiration, not in sympathy, but in judgment. Passengers who had ignored the situation earlier, they were now fully engaged. People who had quietly agreed with Karen's behavior, now they were pretending they hadn't, because nobody wanted to be on the wrong side of history. Karen's breath was shaky as she desperately tried to regain control. I didn't know," she blurted out, her voice suddenly much smaller, weaker. "I thought," but before she could finish, Imani stood. For the first time since Karen tried to push her, since Karen lied, since Karen threw her bag off the plane, Imani rose from her seat with absolute control. And then, she looked Karen directly in the eye. The entire plane was watching, and Imani only said one thing, "That's exactly the problem." Karen's lips parted slightly. Imani's gaze never wavered. "You didn't know, but you assumed." A hush fell over the cabin. Those words sank deep, not just into Karen, but into everyone who had stood by, remained silent, or agreed with her. Because that was it. That was the truth. Karen had spent her entire life avoiding. Karen wasn't wrong because she didn't know who Imani was. She was wrong because she assumed that Imani was less than her. She assumed she didn't belong. And now she was paying for it. Karen's lips trembled. She wasn't the one in control anymore. She wasn't the one who got to decide how this ended. She wasn't the one who had power in this room. Karen's voice cracked. She swallowed, her fake confidence completely shattered. "I didn't mean, please can we just..." Her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides. "I made a mistake." But no one defended her. Not the passengers, not the flight attendants, not even the security officers who now looked at her differently. Karen Miller, for the first time in her life, was alone. The lead security officer sighed and took a step forward, his voice professional but firm. "Miss Miller, you will be removed from this flight immediately." Karen snapped her head toward him, panic surging in her chest. "What? No. You can't do that." She turned to Imani, frantic now. "Tell them, please. I swear, I didn't." But Imani, she didn't say another word, because she didn't need to. Karen's own actions had already spoken for her. The flight attendant, who had originally been hesitant, now stood with quiet satisfaction. She wouldn't be defending Karen either. The whispers among the passengers turned into murmurs of approval. "Yeah, get her out of here. This is what she deserves." "I'm embarrassed I didn't say something earlier." Security reached for Karen's arm, and that's when it all fell apart. No, this isn't fair. I'm the victim here." Karen shrieked, her voice rising in desperation. But it didn't matter. The entire first-class cabin watched as Karen Miller, who once held herself so high, so untouchable, so above everyone else, was now being escorted off the flight. Passengers began clapping. The sound of cheering rang through the cabin. Karen was still screaming, still trying to control a situation she had already lost. But now nobody was listening, and as she disappeared from sight, Imani exhaled slowly and sat back down. The flight attendant approached carefully, her voice softer this time. "Miss Jackson, is there anything we can do to make this right?" Imani, still composed, shook her head with a small smile. "No. I think the lesson has already been taught." The murmurs in the cabin turned into quiet respect. And for the first time since this entire ordeal began, the plane finally felt peaceful. Karen Miller had always believed she was untouchable. She had walked through life believing that the rules did not apply to her, that she could push boundaries, demand special treatment, and get away with behavior others would be punished for. But today that illusion had crumbled, and it was crumbling even further. The moment she was dragged off the plane, kicking and screaming, Karen thought the worst was over, that she could salvage the situation somehow, that she could complain to the right people, demand a refund, call her lawyer, anything to make this go away. She was wrong. A voice called out, "Miss Miller." Karen turned sharply, her head snapping toward the sound of her name. And there, waiting for her, standing tall in a tailored suit, was the lead airline executive. He held a folder in one hand, a neutral yet cold expression on his face. Karen's stomach clenched. The airline weren't about to let her walk away without consequences. Karen straightened her posture, summoning the last of her bravado. She smoothed her blouse, lifted her chin, and plastered on a smug expression. "Oh, finally," she huffed, placing a hand on her hip. "I need to file a complaint about that entire ordeal. I was mistreated. No. I was harassed on that plane." The executive didn't blink, didn't react, didn't even seem remotely interested in what she had to say. Instead, he extended the folder to her. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice cool, emotionless, final, effective immediately, "you are permanently banned from all future flights on this airline." Karen froze. For a moment, her brain refused to process the words. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, but nothing came out. She felt the world shift beneath her feet. Then, like a volcano erupting, the shock gave way to rage. "What? You can't do this to me?" she shrieked, her voice carrying across the entire terminal. Heads turned. Passengers waiting for their flights lifted their heads from their phones. People from different gates peered over, curious. Some already had their cameras out, recognizing her as the woman who was just kicked off that flight. The executive, completely unfazed, gave a slow, measured nod. "Actually, we can." He tilted his head slightly. "And we just did." Karen's entire body shook, her fists clenched, her face turning a shade of red that almost looked unnatural. "You think I'm just going to accept this? I have connections. I'll have your job for this." Passengers watching gasped and muttered. Some started laughing, because Karen sounded ridiculous. And the executive, he looked downright bored. "Miss Miller," he said, his tone not changing in the slightest. "This airline has a zero-tolerance policy for harassment, discrimination, and unruly behavior. Your actions today have resulted in a permanent travel ban across all our flights, effective immediately. You will receive an official notice via email, and any attempt to book a future ticket will be automatically declined." Karen was shaking now. The reality was finally sinking in. "No!" she screamed, stomping her foot like a child. "No, no, no. I'm the victim here." People in the terminal openly laughed now. A teenager whispered to her friend, "Does she actually think this is helping?" A middle-aged woman scoffed, shaking her head. She did this to herself. And the recording, it was already spreading. Karen, for the second time today, had created her own downfall. And this time, there was no recovering from it. The executive sighed, clearly done with her tantrum. He motioned to security. "Please escort Miss Miller out of the terminal." Karen gasped, horrified. "No, you can't. I have a flight to catch. I have places to be." One of the security officers calmly took her by the arm. "Not on this airline, ma'am." And just like that, Karen Miller, the woman who thought she ruled first class, the woman who had spent her entire life demanding special treatment, the woman who had tried to remove the CEO of the airline from her own flight, was now being dragged out of the airport like an unruly child. Passengers in the waiting area, they clapped. Some even cheered. A businessman shook his head with a chuckle. "I love to see karma in real time." A woman whispered to her friend, "She's definitely going viral." And Karen, her final words before she disappeared from sight, "I'll sue you. I'll sue this whole airline. This isn't over." But even she knew it was over, because she wasn't just kicked off a flight. She wasn't just humiliated. She wasn't just banned from an airline. She had been exposed. And in the age of social media, that was something she would never escape. The world had turned against her now. She was a joke. Her name was everywhere. News outlets had picked up the story within hours. The viral clips of her tantrum on the plane, her screaming meltdown at the gate, and the smug confidence draining from her face when she learned who Imani Jackson really was, all of it had spread across every social media platform imaginable. People were dissecting her every word, her every action. They weren't just talking about the flight, they were digging into her past. And Karen, she was losing everything. Her inbox was flooded with angry emails. She had been let go from multiple business engagements. Brands she had partnered with were cutting ties. Her family was receiving messages from reporters asking for statements. She had gone from living a life of privilege to becoming one of the most hated women on the internet. And now, she had one option left, the apology video. The camera clicked on. A dimly lit room. Karen sat in front of a blank wall, her face bare, her eyes red-rimmed from what appeared to be hours of crying. She sniffled, wiping at her cheek, her breath shaky as she looked directly into the lens. I made a terrible mistake." She took a deep, trembling breath. "I was wrong." Her voice cracked at just the right moment. "I let my ignorance cloud my judgment. I never meant to hurt anyone, but I see now that my actions were inexcusable, and I take full responsibility." A single tear slipped out her cheek. She let it stay there, the dramatic pause, the perfect balance of remorse and fragility. She had studied apology videos before. She knew exactly how to make herself look like the victim. "To Ms. Jackson," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, I deeply regret how I treated you. I don't know what came over me. I was overwhelmed, I was frustrated, but that doesn't excuse my behavior. You didn't deserve that. No one does. She exhaled shakily, as if the weight of her actions was just now hitting her. I've spent the last few days reflecting, and I realize now that I need to change. I need to listen. I need to learn, and I promise to do better. Her lips trembled. I hope the world can find it in their hearts to forgive me. Her voice faded into silence. She let the weight of her words linger. Then, with a final, broken breath, she ended the video. She posted it. Within minutes, the caption read, "I'm truly sorry. Please take the time to watch this and understand my heart." For a moment, she sat back, watching the screen, waiting. Would people accept it? Would they finally stop attacking her? Would she get her life back? The first comment came in, then the second, then the flood began, and Karen's stomach dropped, because instead of sympathy, instead of support, instead of forgiveness, she saw this. "Nah, you're just sorry you got caught. We don't believe you. You had no remorse when you were throwing that bag and trying to get her arrested. Too little, too late." Classic PR apology. Zero emotion, zero sincerity, zero accountability. The likes on those comments skyrocketed. More poured in. People mocked her, dissected her video, called out her forced tears, pointed out how she was still making it about herself. Memes exploded. Someone posted a compilation of her apology, mixed with her screaming on the plane. Another edited the video to add fake, Oscar-winning music behind her performance. One tweet went viral. "If you ever feel bad about your mistakes, just remember that Karen Miller thought she could fake cry her way out of this mess, and made it even worse." Over 1 million likes. Karen felt sick. She had hoped that this would be enough. But the world had already made up its mind. Her apology wasn't an apology. It was damage control. And nobody was buying it. The downfall of Karen Miller was officially complete. Do you think her apology video should have been accepted? Let us know in the comments. And if you love this story, hit the subscribe/like button for more powerful stories like this.